but that does exhaust our conversation with this speaker, and I'm going to call on David Barton. Now you will have 5 minutes, Mr. Barton.
Thank you, Madam President and board members. I appreciate your service, and forgive me for any breach of protocol that may happen since I am from Texas. We were contacted by state legislators, former state legislators, and former State Board of Education members. Let me kind of perhaps put perspective on why I think they asked us to testify. In my case, I am considered an expert reviewer and used in states all across the United States in history and social studies standards. So I'm one of the 3 expert reviewers in California, one of the 6 expert reviewers in Texas, and Oklahoma, and Georgia, and Kentucky, and so many other states. And I also consult with the national publishers of textbooks on the textbooks, whether it's the old Houghton Mifflin or Pearson, Ingersoll, etc. So with that, we also have a collection of about 120,000 items from before 1812. We have one of the largest collections of original documents in America, considering extensive collections related to Black history. And so that, I think, is part of the reason that we were asked to provide some perspective. Having done for a number of years, worked with so many states, red, blue, purple, whatever, the objective we always have is truth. And we take a lot of that back to the original documents that we own. We can tell truth because it's not opinion. It is documented, it's factual. And as such, we believe that every aspect of history should present the good, the bad, and the ugly. The truth is presented not in just part of it, all of it. I would contend that a lot of what happens today with our presentation of Black history and Black relations goes back and was highly influenced by a 1902 series that was academically praised by Woodrow Wilson, The History of the American People. Woodrow Wilson took out every... I'm sorry? Okay. Woodrow Wilson took out every single Black person from his 5-volume history, including Frederick Douglass. As a result, today, we do not know the Black history that was there with William Nell, first Black man appointed to the federal government, wrote an entire history book, 1852, on the Black patriots of the American Revolution, the War of 1812. We know little about Joseph Wilson, the Black Felix, put in 1888, all the heroes of the Civil War. These are good stories, and so we know more about the bad, the ugly, than the good, and I would point to Woodrow Wilson as a turning point in that. He was considered by the academic community to be such a great influence, and I would say he was a great influence for negative. So when I look at the 1619 Project, for example, part of what they say is true, but it's often the bad and the ugly. There were Black officials elected to office in America started in 1641. Matthias D'Souza, that's a good story, should be told. Black, what we would call essentially SEAL team members in the American Revolution, just daring things that should be Hollywood movies like Jack Sisson or James Armistead, infrequently told today. So when we do history in other states, we try to get these heroes back in. The bad and the ugly is well known. The analogy I would also use is oftentimes if you've seen a mile-long freight train made up of 1,000 cars in the freight train, the way we approach our academic history today is often we take a snapshot of a couple of cars and say, here's what that train looks like, and that's just not accurate. So while we might get a Frederick Douglass or an MLK or Rosa Parks, rarely do we get a Peter Salem or a Salem Poor or a Prince Estabrook or any of the other heroes that are there as well. So it's a very long train with a lot in it. My encouragement would be to present all of it, the good, the bad, the ugly. The difficulty today is because this has not been included in most academic works since about 1902, you have to dig a lot deeper and go back into previous accounts where the bad and the ugly is clearly there. And that should never be hidden, should never be discouraged from being there. But what I think is often lacking is the good that goes with it as well. So that would be my encouragement. That's why, as I look at the resolution that was introduced last month, I think it tells part of the story, but there's so much more story. And I think tone is very important, that as students get done with their history, they should recognize that humans are flawed, that there are good, there are people who are often mixed. They're not, you can't really stereotype them. Sometimes bad people do good things, and they need to be praised for that good, but condemned for that bad. So it's not just always very easy to make that distinction. And I hope that we don't get into superficial labeling of movements or groups or aspects, but that truth is the objective. And so that's what I try to help with states, and that's why I think I was asked to help participate and at least give input into this one. But that would be my encouragement, is that the resolution covers part of it, but there is a different tone that should be included as well, and many other positives that I think could be part of that. So I'll conclude my testimony with that perspective.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barton. And we will begin our period of 10 minutes of board questions. Are there any questions from board members? Dr. Kilgore.
Mr. Barton labeled George on our site, so much to say. But I appreciate you coming very, as I do the other guests who came to speak to us. And what I find really compelling and interesting, and admittedly, I was raised in, I went to elementary school in the late 50s and 60s, and my history does not include a lot of those heroes that you just lightly touched on, because there's so many in our rich history, and I find that very intriguing and interesting. And I'm hoping that you include references in your comment so that we can go ahead and look into that at a later date. But again, it took courage to come and speak to us, and I really appreciate you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, if I may respond, Ms. Kilgore, we in the testimony that I turned in, I named a lot of these individuals by name, and we do have actual documentation back to original sources. I'm a huge believer in going back to originals, which is why we own so many of them. I mean, this is just personal. I would encourage everyone to read that 1852 book from William Nell. It's available at Google Books. I would encourage the same thing for that 1888 book with Joseph Wilson, The Black Felix. Such inspiring stories that are not heard today. And if you do even a shallow dive into Woodrow Wilson, he's one of the worst racists we've ever had in American history. And it was unfortunate that he was president of Princeton. He was considered a chief academic. Academics looked to him and praised his work. He brought about the revival of the Second Klan in Washington, D.C. His administration openly marched with the Klan. And today he way too much influence. He has too much influence on continuing history today, which is why I think you have to back up before 1902 to get a good view of historical relations in America.
Thank you. Ms. McGuire.
Mr. Barton, have you looked at the American history or civics, social studies textbooks over a period of time? For example, there were blacks in my American history book that are no longer in the American history books. And even, I'm sure you heard of the Black Robe Regiment, where we had lawyers and judges during a period when people thought it couldn't be done, and even the first elected officials to Congress. But what I've seen in my experience with the textbooks is that the good history, along with the bad, the good has been taken out, because things I learned in American history in Memphis, Tennessee, under my favorite teacher, Mr. Kelly, is no longer in the textbook. So do you all look at textbooks to see how balanced history is being presented in the educational system?
Yes, ma'am, we do, and we have seen a number of names taken out. We saw a state recently take out Phyllis Wheatley, who I think is such a terrific lady. Her breakthrough accomplishments back in the early 1800s, late 1700s. But what I'm finding today is, for example, when I was working with the state of Oklahoma in their standards and in presenting historical figures, and one of the things that we have always emphasized is telling the stories of people more than the dates, the names, the places. People are more important than the date that something happened. And so we have a lot of biographical history. We encourage publishers to do that. But I will point out that while I was in Oklahoma, I brought out some facts about some people that they had never heard of. And in Oklahoma, the standards are first done by 70 teachers, and then they ask expert reviewers to come in like we do. And so at that point, the 70 teachers said, well, we've never heard of these people before, and we don't want to start teaching them because we don't know who they are. And we ran up against this thing that because they're not recognized today, therefore they're not important. And so the biggest problem we have with both publishers and with standards is so many of these folks, the names I mentioned earlier, may have been unknown to many. They should be known to every American. I clearly am white, but I do so many Black History Month presentations because I know so many of the heroes. And my point is, why would a white guy care? Because they're Americans. It's American history. It belongs to every single one of us. And if every one of us knew those great heroes, I think we would have a different even relationship today with one another if we had those heroes. So to answer your question, yes, we watch the standards. They are being changed. Names, again, like Phyllis Wheatley was taken out because nobody today really knows who she is. Well, that's not the reason you take them out. You should put them in because we don't know who she is. We need to know. And so that's the emphasis that we have, is including things that may be unknown today but are very, very significant in history. And heroes particularly are something we love to present as great heroes.
And even with Booker T. Washington, he was a slave, but how many know he founded Tuskegee Institute? I mean, that's not in the books. A slave finding and founding or establishing a college so slaves or former slaves could be educated along with others.
Yeah, I would even point out that with someone like Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was photographed more often than Abraham Lincoln. And yet, because Woodrow Wilson took him out, we just don't know much about Frederick Douglass today. His statue was actually torn down in Rochester, New York, thinking he's one of the bad guys. There's no way Frederick Douglass can be a bad guy. And so our lack of knowledge about basic heroes, I think, is a real problem.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to Board Member Fowler Arthur.
And thank you to all of the speakers today, and Mr. Barton, thank you for joining us. I'm realizing that I was really blessed to have some of the books that you have helped write in my curriculum growing up, because I also had the opportunity to know about these wonderful patriots and folks that we want to be included in our history. And so I guess that the question that raises to me is, considering that we are at a point where we've received a lot of testimony in the past few months about these gaps in our history, how do we go to a place where we can make sure that every public school is including these wonderful stories back in history? And how do we make sure that the source documents are being found and included, given the fact that we are in a point where it may not be in everyone's experience, it may not be in the memory of those who've gone through any particular program? How do we reclaim those things that we've lost? Thank you.
That is a great question. I will tell you one of the ways we're approaching this. Obviously, we work within the system with the publisher and others. Our last round in Texas, we were able to raise the number of minority heroes in our textbooks from 9% of the heroes were minorities up to 27%. And that's not because we focus on any particular race or color. It's because we focus on accomplishments. These are guys who should be honored. And so we went up to 27% of our heroes in Texas are now minority members. That's great. That needs to happen elsewhere. But to answer your question, one of the things that I'll be speaking to a group of legislators later this week. And they're from all over the country. It's a network with 1,000 state legislators. And what we will do is introduce to them, say, whatever curriculum you're using back home, one of the things that would help is if you would introduce a state law or state resolution that says, in addition to whatever we're teaching, let's also teach these great heroes. And so we particularly give a list of great Black heroes that, whether it be Lemuel Haynes, the first Black man to receive a degree of higher education in America back in 1804, whether it be Wentworth Cheswell, a Black man who was elected to office in New Hampshire, reelected 49 years, made a Paul Revere type of ride, whoever it is. We have a list of these names and say, go back to your state and mandate that at least these heroes be added, because these are the ones that really largely disappeared from Woodrow Wilson onward, and we go back to those old things. And so that is another way of doing it. But again, we had a lot of resistance with teachers who say, well, I've never heard that before and I don't want to have to learn it now. Okay, let's go to state law, or let's go to state board members, or go to wherever we can. And that's why we also work with the publishers to make sure we get as many of these names into the textbooks as possible, because I think that's just a healthy approach to America in general. You tell the truth, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and you recover forgotten heroes.
Thank you. And that's where we're going to leave it today. Thank you very much for your testimony.